15 years ago, a pastor's mother disappeared during a morning prayer walk in rural Georgia. No body, no witnesses, just her sandals at the edge of the woods, and silence. Now, during church renovations, something is found buried behind the sanctuary. A sealed barrel. And when police start digging, not just through the dirt, but through bloodlines, land records, and the church's founding history, the real horror begins. Because the most faithful weren't who they claimed to be, and the person who orchestrated it all had keys to every locked door. This isn't about a missing woman anymore. It's about why the church needed her gone, and who's still lying to keep it that way. Let's get right into this twisted case. It was the kind of weekend small towns talk about for months. In July 2009, a rising young preacher from Atlanta, Pastor Darius Boone, was bringing his congregation down for a rural outreach. It was to be a weekend of worship, healing, and hope. Services would be held under a large tent on borrowed farmland just outside town limits. The flyers promised deliverance. The crowd, they said, would be unforgettable. And it was. Not because of what happened under the tent, but because of what happened behind it. Darius Boone, just 27 at the time, had momentum. Charismatic, clean-cut, and widely considered anointed. But the spotlight didn't shine on him alone. With him that weekend was a woman many called the true backbone of his ministry. His mother, Matilda Boone. Known for her calm wisdom and sharp instincts, she'd raised Darius alone after the sudden death of his father when he was a child. People said she was quiet, but strong, discerning, the kind of woman who rarely spoke. But when she did, people listened. The outreach kicked off on a Friday. Locals came in droves. There were music, testimonies, healings. Some said they felt power in the air. Until Sunday morning. That day, Matilda Boone left early for what she often called her morning time with God. According to church records and statements gathered later, she'd been up before sunrise. She told one person she was going for a prayer walk behind the tent, just a short stroll through the edge of the woods, where the farmland met a dry creek bed. She never returned. By 9 a.m., volunteers noticed she hadn't taken her seat at the front row of the tent. By 10 o'clock, her son delayed the morning sermon. Some assumed she was simply resting or praying, but by noon, concern turned to panic. People fanned out across the property. They searched the fields, the wooded edge, even the nearby highway. That's when someone spotted them, Matilda's sandals. Perfectly placed at the start of a narrow trail leading into the woods. Not tossed, not trampled, just sitting there, like she'd slipped them off before stepping into something she never came back from. There were no signs of a struggle. No screams had been heard. No personal belongings were missing from her room. A sheriff's search team was called in that afternoon, and dogs were brought in. Nothing. No scent trail, no blood, no clothing. It was like the earth swallowed her whole. Within 48 hours, the revival was shut down. Volunteers went home. The tent came down, and the small town was left with a mystery that no one could explain. Matilda Boone had vanished. No body, no leads, just silence. And for the next 15 years, that's all the town would get. Until one summer afternoon, when construction workers broke ground behind that same church and found something the soil had kept hidden since that day. But back in 2009, no one knew that. All they knew was that the woman who raised the preacher had gone for a walk and never came back. In the days that followed Matilda Boone's disappearance, the town wasn't just quiet, it was haunted. The revival tents were gone, but the unease lingered. people said the air in that part of the woods felt heavier, like it remembered. With no body and no trace, explanations came quickly, but not all of them made sense. The official investigation stalled within weeks. Local authorities combed the surrounding land, but with no evidence of foul play, the file sat open and eventually untouched. And so, the gaps in the case were filled not by facts, but by rumors. Some insisted Matilda had been taken in a spiritual sense. They claimed she had entered a realm beyond the physical, that she was too holy for the world and had been caught up by God during her morning prayer. Others weren't as poetic. They believed something darker had happened. An animal attack, maybe. Coyotes, a bear, or worse. But those who lived nearby said there hadn't been a reported animal attack in that region for years. No drag marks, no blood, no signs of a scuffle. Just sandals and silence. Then came the name people began saying under their breath, Alton Ray. He was known, but no one really knew him. A drifter. Mid-50s, disheveled, sometimes lucid, sometimes not. He'd been living in a small blue tent about a mile from the church property. Some days he walked to town and stared into the diner windows. Other days he stood outside the gas station talking to people who weren't there. Sheriff's deputies visited his camp on the second day of Matilda's disappearance. It was empty. The tent had been torched, reduced to ashes and twisted metal stakes. His few belongings, a duffel bag, torn clothes, a half-empty Bible, were gone. Not a single person had seen him since that morning. For some in town, that was all they needed. The story wrote itself. Alton Ray must have followed Matilda. Maybe he snapped. Maybe he dragged her into the woods and vanished like the ghost people said he was. That theory spread fast, especially among those who wanted an ending, even a terrible one. But others weren't convinced. They pointed out the convenient timing, how the church packed up so quickly after the search ended, how Pastor Darius Boone stopped talking about his mother altogether. No public pleas. No second search party, not even a vigil, just quiet prayers and sermons that felt to some too practiced. Behind closed doors, some longtime residents began asking questions they never voiced in public. Why was no one from the church pressing harder for answers? Why didn't Darius stay longer to help investigators? And why, despite all the whispers, did the congregation seem so eager to move on? Before her name was tied to a disappearance, Matilda Boone was known simply as Sister Boone, a soft-spoken, deeply respected woman with decades of quiet service behind her. In church circles, she was seen less as a background figure and more as a pillar, the kind of presence people noticed without her ever trying to be noticed. She didn't preach. She didn't lead worship, but everyone knew. Her voice mattered, especially to her son. By the time Pastor Darius Boone launched his ministry in Atlanta, Matilda had already spent years building her life around the church. Widowed young, she raised Darius with discipline, prayer, and an unshakable sense of direction. Those close to the family said she was never flashy about her faith. She didn't chase titles or recognition, but she was discerning, sharp in ways that made even pastors check their motives. To many, she was the kind of woman you didn't lie to. She'd know. That's what made her disappearance so jarring, and what made the details surrounding it more troubling the deeper you looked. In the weeks before the 2009 outreach in the small town, something shifted. According to phone records obtained later during the cold case review, Matilda made a series of late-night phone calls, all to the same number. That number belonged to Lila Hart, the longtime church secretary. The two women had worked closely for years, but those who knew them wouldn't have called them close friends. Their relationship was cordial, professional. So the sudden frequency of those calls raised questions. No one knows exactly what was said in those conversations, but according to one junior staff member at the time, Matilda had recently approached her about requesting a closed-door meeting with the church elders. She didn't say why. She only said it needed to happen soon. That meeting never took place. What's also confirmed, on the morning she disappeared, Matilda wasn't alone. She had gone for a sunrise prayer walk, a routine she followed often. But this time, Lila Hart went with her. Lila told investigators that Matilda had invited her the night before, that she wanted to spend time interceding for the outreach. They left the tent grounds together just after 5:30 a.m., seen briefly by a volunteer prepping chairs for the morning service. Matilda was wearing a long gray sweater, soft shoes, and carried nothing but a small leather Bible. By 7:15, Lila returned alone. At first, she claimed they had parted ways when Matilda wanted to continue walking deeper into the trail. That she, Lila, turned back because of her knees. She never raised an alarm, never reported Matilda missing. She simply returned, changed clothes, and took her place at the secretary's table near the altar. Hours later, when Matilda still hadn't appeared, concern began to build. But Lila remained calm, almost detached. In hindsight, that detail stood out. The last person to see Matilda Boone alive was also the first to stop talking about it. A woman like Matilda doesn't just vanish. And the more investigators learned about those final days, the calls, the unspoken meeting, the prayer walk that ended with one woman missing, the more it seemed her disappearance wasn't just sudden. It was silenced. It started like any routine church upgrade. In the spring of 2024, the small-town church where the outreach had taken place years ago had outgrown its old baptism pool. With the church now serving hundreds weekly, the board approved a renovation project. A larger, modernized baptism area built just behind the sanctuary. The plan was simple: dig, lay the plumbing, pour concrete, move on. But on May 14th, just after 11 a.m., a backhoe operator stopped mid-dig. He'd struck something hard beneath the soil, something metal. At first, they assumed it was debris from old construction, maybe leftover equipment buried during earlier expansions. What they unearthed was no equipment. It was a sealed, rusted metal drum, industrial grade, heavy, no markings, welded shut. Per protocol, work was halted and the police were called. Once the drum was opened under law enforcement supervision, the odor alone told them this wasn't just buried trash. Inside, wrapped tightly in faded white and gold church robes, was a human body. The remains were shockingly intact. The presence of powdered lime had slowed decomposition. The skull was still whole, bones carefully positioned, a rosary tangled in what remained of the hands. There were no signs of trauma immediately visible, but one thing was certain: the burial wasn't haphazard. Someone had taken time. Someone had planned this. Within 48 hours, dental records confirmed the unthinkable. The body belonged to Matilda Boone. The woman who vanished during a prayer walk 15 years earlier had never left the property. She had been buried in sacred ground, behind the church. The reaction from the congregation was immediate and chaotic. Gasps, fainting, questions. As detectives revisited the original disappearance, patterns began to surface. Details that hadn't raised red flags in 2009, but now screamed for attention. For starters, Darius Boone's response back then had been subdued. Investigators noted that within 2 months of his mother's disappearance, he had stopped speaking about her altogether. No memorial, no continued public appeals, no rewards offered. While some interpreted that as a son coping quietly, Others saw it differently. He didn't just stop talking about her. He shut the entire chapter. Detectives also learned he had refused multiple interview requests after the initial search. When questioned in 2009 about pursuing a private investigation or pressuring authorities, his response was limited to, "Whatever happened was God's will." Now, with her body confirmed and the burial site directly tied to church property, those words didn't sit right. Why hadn't he pushed harder? Why hadn't he insisted on searching every inch of the church grounds? And most chilling of all, how could the very place he once preached have concealed his mother's corpse, without him ever knowing? Or had he known all along? By the time police returned to question Lila Hart, she was 73 years old, wheelchair-bound, and still seated at her usual post in the church's front office. Despite the church's growth over the years, Lila had never stepped away. She remained the record keeper, the scheduler, the quiet gatekeeper of everything administrative. And for over a decade, no one had thought to question her again. That changed the moment Matilda Boone's body was identified. Detectives re-entered the case with fresh eyes. The timeline was reviewed, statements re-examined, and one name came up more than once: Lila Hart, the last person seen with Matilda, the one who returned from the prayer walk alone, the one who never raised an alarm. When investigators arrived for a formal interview, Lila's demeanor was polite but fragile. She spoke softly, leaning on claims of memory lapses and age-related confusion. At first, she said Matilda never arrived that morning, claimed she'd been waiting for her by the trail, but eventually gave up and returned to camp. When asked if she told anyone at the time, she replied she didn't want to worry the others. But just hours later, under a second round of questioning, her version changed. This time, Lila said they had walked together, but Matilda wanted to go deeper into the woods to meditate. Lila claimed she turned back when her knees began to ache. The implication was simple: Matilda chose to be alone. Lila just respected that. When pressed further, her story changed again. Now she said Matilda had been distracted, that she had seemed heavy with something on her mind, that she'd told Lila she needed clarity and silence. She said Matilda walked ahead and out of sight. Lila waited a while, then returned to the tent. 3 different stories, all from the same woman, and all lacking a single mention of concern. But the unraveling didn't end there. As part of the reopened investigation, detectives began requesting old church documents, land use records, tax filings, permits, anything that might offer insight into what happened behind the building where Matilda was buried. What they found was a 2009 ledger showing a curious line item: sealed storage barrels, approved for fermentation purposes. The documents listed Lila Hart as the authorizing signature. The destination for the barrels? A section behind the outreach sanctuary, just feet from where Matilda's body was found. The problem? The church never had a vineyard, never sold wine, never made communion juice in-house, and there was no record of barrels ever arriving or being used. To make matters worse, how did it get to the outreach ground? It wasn't just an oddity. It was a planted paper trail. Lila had authorized sealed barrels on church grounds at the exact time Matilda disappeared, and never told a soul. There was no follow-up, no inspection. Just a line in a ledger, and her name at the bottom. When presented with the documents, Lila blinked slowly. "I don't remember doing that," she said. But her expression said otherwise. It was the first crack, and it wouldn't be the last. Because from this point forward, Lila Hart wasn't just a secretary. She was a suspect. Law enforcement worked behind the scenes, combing through physical evidence, interviewing former church staff, and submitting the remains for full forensic analysis. Among the routine steps was one that seemed procedural at best: confirm identity through DNA testing. Matilda had already been identified by dental records, and the presence of her church robe and rosary left little doubt. But protocol required it. What no one expected was that this standard step would become the next earthquake in an already unraveling story. The test didn't just confirm who Matilda was, it revealed that she had two biological children. One of them was known, Darius Boone, now the well-established pastor of their ministries. The other was a woman, still living. And when the lab cross-referenced her DNA with existing databases tied to church records, they found an exact match within the congregation. She was the church's assistant pastor. She had been serving beside Darius for years, in leadership meetings, at revival events, on stage during worship. They were close, very close. Longtime members of the church had quietly whispered about their relationship for months. Some said they were dating. Others hinted at engagement. Neither had ever confirmed anything publicly, but their body language said enough. They weren't just colleagues. They were emotionally involved, and neither of them knew they were related. When detectives approached her with the findings, she reportedly went silent for nearly a full minute before asking just one question: "Are you saying she was my mother?" The fallout was instant and deeply personal. Privately, both Darius and the assistant pastor stopped attending meetings. Church services went on, but without their usual presence on the pulpit. Guest speakers were brought in to cover sermons. Behind the scenes, investigators tried to understand how a truth this explosive had remained hidden for so long. The answer, it seemed, had been hinted at, but overlooked. A former member of the women's ministry came forward during the investigation with a detail she hadn't thought significant at the time. Weeks before Matilda vanished, she had confided something cryptic. "I kept one secret too long, and it's about to cost more than I can carry." At the time, no one pressed her on it. People assumed she was talking about church finances or health issues. But now, in the context of the DNA test, the meaning was painfully clear. Matilda had given birth to two children. One was raised publicly, proudly, her son, Darius. The other had been hidden in plain sight. How that child ended up in the church, how she rose to leadership, and whether Matilda ever intended to tell her the truth remains unknown. What is clear is that she didn't get the chance. Because whatever Matilda Boone was planning in the weeks before her disappearance, whatever secret she was finally ready to confront, it had stayed buried with her, until the dirt behind the church gave it back. As detectives dug deeper into the origins of the church, their focus turned to the man who once loomed over it all, Elder Vernon Wallace. To most, Elder Wallace was a founding figure. He had passed away more than a decade ago, shortly before the ministry gained its current name and platform under Darius Boone's leadership. To the congregation, he was spoken of with reverence, an old-school man of God, firm in doctrine, fatherly in tone, untouchable in legacy. But the archive room in the church basement told a different story. Buried in dusty filing cabinets, law enforcement discovered a series of handwritten letters, taped cassette recordings, and notes addressed to church leadership that had never been publicly disclosed. They were dated between 1986 and 1994. The contents were disturbing. The materials described a pattern. Multiple young women, many of them new converts, had been targeted by Elder Wallace during rural church outreaches, isolated trips meant for revival, healing, and baptism. But instead, For some, those nights ended behind locked doors, under the weight of spiritual manipulation disguised as mentorship. Two names appeared more than once: Matilda Boone and Lila Hart. Matilda's letters were subtle. She never named names, but hinted at shameful nights and being tested in silence. Lila's were more protective, defending Wallace as a man struggling with temptation, but anointed beyond question. But it was the paternity revelation that shook everything. DNA results had already proven that Darius and the assistant pastor were half-siblings. But now, with the emergence of old church correspondence, there was no need to speculate who the father was. Multiple letters referenced a quiet financial arrangement Wallace had maintained for years. One document, a handwritten budget marked for Sister M.B., detailed monthly payments that ceased in 2008, 1 year before Matilda's disappearance. Wallace had fathered both of Matilda's children during different stages of her involvement in the church, and Layla had known all along. From the letters, it became clear that Lila had not only been aware of the relationships, she had worked to protect Wallace's reputation long after his death. She archived the letters, hid the financial logs, never reported the abuse. And when Matilda began making phone calls in 2009, reaching out late at night, requesting a meeting with the elders, Leela knew what was coming. Matilda was going to reveal it all. According to one tape found in the archive, Matilda had drafted a letter to the elders titled, "A Truth Too Long Buried." It was never sent. But a handwritten copy of the opening paragraph was recovered. In it she wrote, "I am not ashamed of my children, but I am ashamed of the silence that raised them." The confession was clear, and the intention? Undeniable. Matilda Boone was ready to expose the very foundation the church had been built on. But Lila Hart wasn't just a secretary, she was a gatekeeper. To her, Matilda's truth wasn't a righteous reckoning, it was a threat to the church, a threat to Wallace's memory, and most of all, a threat to Darius Boone's rise. And some threats, in Lila's mind, didn't deserve to live. By now, investigators had uncovered enough evidence to piece together a chilling and plausible timeline, one built not on fantasy or speculation, but on patterns, records, and years of deliberate silence. The conclusion wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cinematic, it was brutal, personal, and disturbingly methodical. It started with a call. Sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m., on the night before Matilda Boone vanished, Lila Hart placed a phone call from the church landline to Matilda's personal number. The call lasted just under 6 minutes. Phone records confirmed it. Witnesses later recalled that Matilda seemed withdrawn during the evening service, leaving early with a soft, "I'll see you in the morning." At 5:30 a.m., as scheduled, the two women left together for what Lila would later describe as a prayer walk. It was a tradition Matilda had long practiced, but this time it wasn't about reflection or meditation. According to detectives, it was about confrontation. Based on the recovered letters, phone logs, and later statements, Matilda had been preparing to reveal Elder Wallace's past and the full extent of Lila's knowledge. She had delayed too long, and Lila knew her silence was running out. Investigators believe the confrontation turned violent within minutes of reaching the secluded edge of the wooded trail behind the tent. There were no weapons, no planning for a fight. But there was a stone, a large one, found near the eventual burial site, marked with traces of bone and dried organic residue. Too degraded for complete DNA confirmation, but consistent with trauma. Matilda didn't run. She likely never expected the blow. Lila, investigators believe, acted in panic, but not confusion. Her actions afterward were too structured, too intentional. She returned to the church camp calmly, just after 7 a.m., changed her clothes, and took her seat at the secretary's table. When asked later if she had seen Matilda that morning, she shrugged and said, "She must still be praying." But the body was already being moved. 2 deacons were recorded on the church's supply log as having assisted Lila with what she described as secure barrel placement for communion storage. They believed they were following protocol. Lila had filled out a request form for sealed storage for future use. The men helped her carry the welded drum to a marked plot behind the sanctuary, pre-dug during a prior landscaping project, and sealed it with soil and gravel. Neither of them knew what was inside. Neither of them asked. Within 5 years, both men were dead. One died in a house fire after reportedly falling asleep with a lit cigarette. The other suffered a stroke while jogging alone near Lake Halford. Neither death was ruled suspicious. No autopsies were revisited, but for detectives, their absence closed the loop. For 15 years, Lila Hart sat in the front office of the ministry, filing documents, taking calls, and smiling politely at grieving families, while a secret decayed just yards away from her desk. There were no slips, no confessions, no remorse. If she prayed, no one heard it. Because for Lila, it wasn't murder. It was loyalty. It was control. It was devotion. By the time summer faded into fall in 2024, the walls had already closed in around Lila Hart. Her interviews were unraveling, her timeline shredded by old church records and phone logs. Her signature had been found on documents no one could explain. And the 2 men who might have backed her story? Dead. Quietly. Permanently. But no one anticipated how the truth would finally surface. It wasn't through pressure. It wasn't during a formal interrogation. It came on a Sunday morning, in front of everyone, and no one noticed until the audio was pulled. It happened during communion. Lila, now frail and in a wheelchair, had stopped participating in active church functions weeks earlier. But out of habit or defiance, she still sat in the back office during services, often watching the sermon feed on a monitor with the sanctuary's audio routed into a side speaker. That day, she had been asked to help organize some archived communion materials. Her lapel mic, clipped on out of routine by a volunteer who forgot to disable the channel, was live, broadcasting. To the sound booth, it was just background noise, papers shifting, a chair creaking, the occasional cough. But then, a voice. Low, raspy, whispering to no one in particular. She was going to ruin him. A pause. I gave him this life. Another pause. Then, he became someone because she vanished. The technician monitoring the feed froze. He played it back again. And again. Then recorded it. Then called his supervisor. Within 48 hours, the clip was in the hands of detectives. It was barely 60 seconds long. There was no mention of names. No confession of violence. But anyone familiar with the case, and with Lila's role in it, understood the meaning clearly. It wasn't guilt. It was pride. Lila wasn't grieving what she'd done. She believed she had saved something, preserved a future that Matilda had threatened to unravel. To her, Matilda wasn't just holding a secret. She was a danger to the order of things. A woman on the edge of pulling the curtain back on everything. On Elder Wallace, on Darius, on herself. Lila had been silent for 15 years not because of shame, but because she believed the silence had built something worth protecting. And the disappearance? The cover-up? The body in the barrel? To Lila Hart, that was the cost of legacy. For investigators, it wasn't the kind of confession that could guarantee a conviction. It wasn't admissible in court as a direct admission of guilt. But paired with the altered testimonies, the financial records, the burial barrel authorization, and her proximity to the crime, it was enough. Police filed a motion to have her arrested and held for questioning under suspicion of murder and obstruction of justice. A warrant was issued quietly. But time, as it turned out, had one more twist to offer. 2 weeks after her arrest, before prosecutors could even file formal charges, she collapsed in her holding cell. Massive cardiac arrest. She was pronounced dead at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. There would be no courtroom testimony, no confession on record, no cross-examination under oath. The woman who had outlived secrets, scandals, and sermons was gone, just like that. For many in the community, it felt like justice slipped through their fingers. Again. But what she left behind was enough. Enough to fracture the foundation of the church she once helped run. Enough to change how everything was remembered. Pastor Darius Boone, silent through most of the investigation, finally addressed the congregation in a closed-door meeting a week after Lila's death. What was said in that room has never been officially recorded. Those who attended later described it as more of a resignation than a sermon. His tone was reportedly calm, remorseful, but distant. He didn't deny what had been uncovered. He didn't defend Lila. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said he was stepping away. Permanently. The assistant pastor, whose name was withheld in official statements due to pending legal and privacy issues, resigned that same week. Pregnant, and now believed to be the half-sister of the man she'd been romantically involved with, she was said to be in emotional isolation, according to one church board member. Privately, she told friends she no longer trusted the DNA test. That maybe it had been wrong. Maybe it was manipulated. Maybe none of it was real. But she couldn't be sure. And she couldn't stay. How did no one see it coming? How does a church bury its own? And how many secrets still sleep beneath sanctuaries across America? In the end, only one thing remains uncontested. One body, one truth, one woman's silence. That shook everything.